scenarios that your community might be facing for parks and recreation specifically, and some pitfalls that you might avoid when using a multi-jurisdictional planning approach. And then, as Charlene mentioned, we'll be looking at a couple of different case studies, and then talk a little bit about some part-of-specific information that is going to be useful to you moving into our part-of process. We've been looking at some multi-jurisdictional plans that people have been submitting as part of their part-of applications, and some of them have been fantastic documents, and then others maybe not quite so stellar. So we want to talk a little bit about that too. So some things to note about multi-jurisdictional plans. There's a couple of characteristics that they have in common. Some of them are, well, all of them have some geographical boundary issues. The thing is that there is not necessarily a cookie cutter approach that you can take when we're talking about geographic boundaries. I think a lot of you that have heard me talk before about green infrastructure planning. Well, many of these multi-jurisdictional plans are utilizing a green infrastructure approach. And by that I mean we're looking at what features on a landscape are being documented in your plan that kind of tie it together. Is it a mountain range? Is it a watershed? Are we utilizing the information that we're gathering from the landscape to do a blueways plan? Is there a mountain range, or are there some landscape features that are kind of tying some of these recreational amenities together? Is that what's kind of bringing all these things together? Oftentimes that's the case with a trails network. Although that's not necessarily the only thing that can bring it together. It can be estuaries, blueways, but there might necessarily be more political boundaries, like county lines or COG region. In North Carolina, we have COGs, councils of governments, so it might be like a 4 or 5 county region. It can also be a service area or a footprint that defines more of a rural area. What are we trying to provide for people? Is it a service area boundary, or is it an ecological boundary, or is it both? And there's also management characteristics for multi-jurisdictional planning. There's a variety of agencies that may be involved, and that could be at the local, state, and federal levels of government. And there's also private property managers. And I'm thinking, at least in the Western region, a lot of recreational amenities are managed by utilities. A lot of our lakes and impoundments are managed by like Duke Power or TVA, which is kind of a quasi-governmental entity. In rural areas, you might be planning greenways in that are going through a lot of agricultural areas. And there's other large-scale property managers. And another utility might be utilizing transmission line easements that are utilized often for greenway corridors. So there's oftentimes a lot of stakeholders that have to be involved in these planning processes that you might not otherwise be engaged in a smaller scale plan. So, you know, I think the big takeaway when you're looking at kind of pulling together a multi-jurisdiction plan is you're looking at a much larger scale, not just in geographic area, but also from a management scale and a stakeholder scale. So why is it beneficial to be looking at a planning process at a scale and a level like this? Well, obviously, you're going to be getting a more comprehensive planning document when you're looking at a scale that is involving more than just a single entity. If you stop and think about it, say you are representing a single municipality. Well, what's the likelihood that the residents of your municipality are only recreating within the boundaries of your municipality? It's not very likely. So even when we are looking at documents, um, master plans for a single municipality, we are really looking for an assessment and an inventory um, for recreational amenities beyond just the boundaries of that municipality. Well, what a multi-jurisdictional plan can do is give you a broader lens um, for assessing needs for not just the folks in your community, but the folks that are actually coming into your area to use the amenities that you're providing, but also what residents are using that live in your community going outside your community. So kind of think of it more as a network of residential um, provision and use and usage. You're looking at priorities not just for immediate needs, but long-term needs in a network. You're also creating an opportunity, and this is important, I think, to create relationships with people that you might not otherwise have an opportunity to work with. Um, those relationships, it's not just a superficial thing. You are um, creating an opportunity to develop partnerships for um, developing management opportunities, share resources, and um, to hopefully provide some funding partnerships. And that is especially important when you are developing recreation resources that are getting more and more expensive every day. And if you don't believe me, talk to somebody that has built some long distance trails recently. And you'll probably hear more about that when we get into the case studies that's coming up. These things are not inexpensive to build. And it's almost um, it just can't be done by a single community. So it's going to take partnerships, and without those relationships being cultivated, those big projects just are not going to get done. I think also, and this is, kind of something that I have learned by working in some of these large projects. As a planner for a local government, there is such a thing as branding for a local community and sharing an identity. And there is value there uh, economically, and I think from a sense of pride for a local community to see itself as part of something larger than just a single community. And you're seeing this more and more, I think, in the western part of the state, which is what I'm familiar with. And I think probably other parts of the state could probably have examples of the same thing. Um, and you're starting to see this more and more being advertised and branded as such. You're seeing it more in tourism development. I think it's a good thing, and it's been a long time coming. Maybe we can have some discussion about this in the comments afterwards, but um, it, it's something that has taken a long time to develop, but I think our recreation amenities and the way that they're being developed, especially some of these long distance trails projects and these state parks projects, have gone a long way into developing some of that. Obviously, multi-jurisdictional planning can really assist environmental protection efforts that are ongoing in the region, particularly in some of the large park projects and trail projects. And I think that done well, they can provide higher levels of fiscal responsibility. And by that, I mean it's more easy to manage and to plan rather than doing it kind of piecemeal. They can be recreation projects and environmental protection projects can be done um, kind of together. And I'm seeing that more and more. We're seeing projects with clean water management projects. And so not only are they able to provide some good match for each other from a grant perspective, but it's also better environmentally to kind of have one disturbance episode rather than, you know, multiple ones. So, and that can be coordinated in a master planning project. And we're starting to see that more and more. In fact, just yesterday afternoon, I met with clean water management folks on some projects in our region. And really, you know, those kind of conversations wouldn't be happening were it not for communities that are kind of stepping up and working together. I think also that once communities start working together, they kind of start shouldering some of the work and some of the enthusiasm to keep good big projects moving. Not everybody can maintain the same level of perseverance over time on everything. And when there's more people involved, big projects seem to keep moving with more certainty. And um, there's just I think a greater level of assurance that some of these timelines are maintained because there's more people keeping an eye on them. And I think also um, multi-jurisdictional planning really can save planning dollars for everybody. Uh, and here's the big if. You've got to keep everybody engaged throughout the entire process, because if people start dropping out, it is no longer multi-jurisdictional. And that's when we start getting into the pitfalls. And that's what I want to just talk a little bit about next. And here's just some general comments. You could probably say this about any planning process, but to me, it's almost more apparent and obvious for a multi-jurisdictional process. You have got to select the members of your planning process wisely, because if your planning team is not representative of all the jurisdictions that are involved, you do not have a multi-jurisdictional process. Then you don't have a legitimate plan, okay? When it comes time to actually implement your document, whoever was left out will not obviously have, I mean, it may be that they would buy into it later, but there's certainly no, you certainly don't have any evidence that they would have to. They certainly would not necessarily be compelled to adopt it. There's nothing there that would make them do it. You would hope that they would follow along, but they don't have to. Another big tip, and again, this is for people who are listening that have planning backgrounds, I'm sure that this is obvious to you, but it might not be obvious to elected officials who are trying to save a buck. But here's a big one. Make sure that you have good technical expertise. And I don't mean necessarily technical expertise of your recreation staff, or maybe even your in-house planning staff. I always recommend that an outside consultant be hired, and here's why. Twofold. Most recreation staff or planning staff even that you have as in-house already have full-time jobs and are usually already have an overloaded plate. This is a big job, and taking this on means something else has to come off the plate. So unless you have got a lot of work that you do not care that if they finish and want them to take this on, then you really need to bring in a consultant to take this on, just to manage it. Because they have other stuff they have to do. Secondly, I'm not saying that this necessarily would become contentious, but there might be, when it comes to the time for the planning process, some people who show up with an axe to grind about something, and you don't want your staff to have to be the human shields, okay? That's what you pay somebody to come in and do. So I really feel like without bringing in something, a paid consultant, a planning process could probably languish and become neglected if it's not someone's priority. Consultants usually are worth the money that you pay them, usually. So it's something that I recommend. And if you're really not willing to pay a little bit for a consultant, you're probably not willing to pay a lot for what the implementation steps are going to be. And then secondly, and your consultant can help with this, make sure that you're encompassing the appropriate geographic boundaries. Again, you don't want to leave somebody out, but you also don't want to get so big that your planning process just becomes almost irrelevant. Here's the big one, and Charlene can probably elaborate on this after we talk about our case studies. But one of the things that we're finding with some of these multi-jurisdictional plans is some people shortcutting on public participation, and that is a huge no-no. We have some pretty strict requirements for public participation in our grant program, but you should too, okay, for a variety of reasons. All the money that's ultimately going to get spent developing these recreational amenities is probably ultimately going to be developed with taxpayer dollars. So that's their money. You want to make sure that you're giving them what they want, and you need to listen to find out what that is. And don't just be a cursory listener. Really listen. You want to make sure that what you're ultimately building is not just, one elected official's big idea, okay? Because that elected official is going to be there for a few years and then they're going to be done. And you're going to be stuck with whatever was that one person's big thing. You have to make sure it's the community's big thing too, okay? Because they're the one that's going to have to maintain it for the next 50 years or whatever. And then finally, when you get your finished planning document, and that document has been through the public participation process, you've polished your apple, it's what you want, you've gotten all these jurisdictions to adopt it, you love it, then use it. Do not put it on a shelf and only use it to submit with your grant to get money. Okay? Use it. Use it as a guidance document. And then revise it, because ultimately you are going to find out that something got left out. Opportunities are going to arise. Things that were selected to be the number one priority might not necessarily be the number one priority when a bargain piece of property shows up for the number two priority, and you need to move quickly because that family is going to give you 90 days to buy that piece of property or whatever. Things are going to change. Things are going to juggle around. So I'm just keep an open mind and realize that, when that plan is finished and adopted, that's the first day of the next plan revision. Planning document is a living document. It's constantly being revised, and you'll use it. A good planning document is a worn out document because you're using it all the time. So I want to turn this over to Ben, who's going to talk to you about how they developed their process, how they developed their plan, and how it's being implemented in the Yadkin Valley and in the town of Rutherfordton. Rutherfordton, the wonderful Rutherfordton.